Hello and welcome back to another reaction. Today we are taking a look at History Matters. Was King John really such a bad king? He just put this out about a day ago. I actually wanted to record a video last night, but our internet was being funky and I ultimately couldn't. I watched the first 10 seconds and then it started buffering eternally and I had to stop. But today we're taking a look at this. I've mentioned this prior, that one of the big things with teaching history rather than being able to focus in means that much of what I get to focus on is the broader aspects, the column A leads to column B, which isn't even all that accurate, really, as a series of events. Realistically, there's so many different interlocking pieces and effects that very few, if any, events throughout human history have one or two direct causes. There's usually a stack of different issues and problems that lead up to a major event. But the thing that, at least in America, I feel like King John is the best known for is the fact that he ends up signing. He doesn't actually write his name. I believe he puts his seal because he doesn't know how to read or write, or he at least doesn't know how to write. He might know how to read. Onto the Magna Carta, which kind of becomes this incredibly important document that will eventually lead to inspiring the English Bill of Rights in the late 1600s, the American Declaration of Independence, and then Constitution. But of course, there's problems leading up to this. King John has to sign that after a civil war, and I believe after he stopped allowing Parliament to meet. But this is where we get into a problem. There's so many different royal monarchs that it's hard to, especially if you don't specialize in that field, to center yourself on that, especially when you don't care as much, I guess, about the individual rulers compared to the broader effects. But let's take a look. King John is widely considered one of the worst kings in English history. And let's see, I'm assuming the way that he phrased this, that he's going to kind of push back against that a little bit. But we'll discuss it.
King John of England does not have a good reputation. His reign is seen as one of military disaster, political crisis and economic ruin. But to what extent was all of this his fault? Was King John a bad ruler, was he just unlucky, or were the problems of his reign a combination of both?
And you'll see this, the answer I'm going to just say immediately, and I know that we're going to get into this more, it's going to be number 3, because almost never is it purely, oh, they botched it. There's plenty of people who end up gaining power that end up doing poorly with it. But there's usually additional pieces with it. We'll keep going and see what he has to say.
So before we begin, it's important to tackle a common misconception. There's an idea that King John was so incredibly bad that no monarch ever gave the name to their children, lest they risk another one taking the throne. This isn't true, and there were actually numerous princes called John, and briefly one was the heir to the throne.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, if there was an English king that you probably shouldn't have named your child after, it would be Charles, who was executed during the English Civil War in the 1600s. But then his kid, Charles II, ends up becoming the king after the Civil War ends, and then we now have a Charles III. So, you know, if there was going to be one that you wouldn't want to name your kid it after, I'd argue it should be Charles over John. That's beside the point.
The name of a ruling monarch was simply a case of which heir made it to adulthood and which didn't. And for most of history, this was just down to luck. Anyway, so as you'll know, King John came to the throne after the death of his brother, King Richard I, aka Richard the Lionheart. Richard is most famous for his crusading exploits, which won him a lot of good press with his contemporaries.
Absolutely.
Furthermore, whilst he was off crusading, John was trying to undermine him, which soured his reputation somewhat.
Yep.
And later, when Richard was being held prisoner by the Holy Roman Emperor, John, along with the King of France, tried to bribe the Emperor not to release him. In the end, though, Richard was ransomed for an eye-watering amount of money in 1194 and released back to England, where he allowed John to keep his head. This
is also an important thing to point out, that Richard was primarily focused on his faith, on his crusading, and on their French territories. A lot of English lands were in France at this point. I believe that Richard himself spoke French, primarily. He might have known English. I don't know that I don't know one way or the other off the top of my head. But I know for a fact that his primary language was French. Which is weird when you think about the fact that he is an English king. But you've got to remember that the line that starts as, or the kind of kingdom that we're talking about here, had previously been established by the Norman conquests. The Normans being from Normandy in northern France.
It was mostly because Richard didn't have any children, and offering your own brother an heir wasn't a good look. Although, if he had done, England would have at least had a King Arthur, but alas, no. Anyway, Richard died in 1199 and his brother succeeded him. And whilst the crown of England transferred without incident, these territories in France used different succession laws.
Yeah, look at that huge chunk of red here. Look at this big chunk of red on the left side. That's what Richard was primarily focused on, was the French territories of England. And that's going to be a big piece of that. So even when he comes back from crusading, which he's crusading for a long time, he's not really centered in England. This is pretty much entirely going to be John's playground for the most part here.
Meaning that they would go to John's nephew, the aforementioned Arthur, which John didn't like, and as such, rebellion. John wanted to shore up his grip on his lands in France to help crush this revolt, and so he opted for a strategic marriage. Of course, he was already married, but that was quickly annulled. John was able to do this because he and his wife were cousins and they hadn't asked the Pope. Anyway, he soon married...
Yeah, and that's the big piece. Catholicism throughout this period does not allow divorce. But an annulment is just as good, arguably better, for kings, because it says, oh, no. You see, it's not that you're separating, it's that you were never meant to be married in the first place. And that's why they point out they're cousins. Can't marry your cousin, or at least not a close cousin. And we didn't ask the Pope. So if the Pope didn't bless it, then it's not okay. And that's a big thing. The failure to get a wedding annulled or a marriage annulled is actually going to be what ends up leading to the collapse of Catholicism as the dominant religion in England. I mean, it's not the only thing, but King Henry VIII, that's not the focus today. We're looking at King John.
Married the lady of these lands, Isabella of Angoulême. The primary issue, well, at least one of them, Isabella was only about 12 at the time of the wedding, was the fact that she was already engaged. Her former betrothed appealed to King Philippe II of France, who then commanded John to attend his court to answer for this insult. And since John held titles in France which were in service to the French king, Philippe believed that John had no choice but to attend.
Yeah, and this is where the feudal system is a solid reminder that it is insane. So while they may be king of England, they are the duke of these other areas and the count of other regions as well. So here we go. All of these titles, he's the Duke of Normandy, which, remember, at this point the English crown is descended from the Norman conquest successfully done by William the Conqueror. So he's the Duke of Normandy, he's the Duke of Aquitaine, and he's the Count, which is a lower position, of these next four regions. Anjou, Poitou, Maine, and Anjou. I know that I butchered all of those. Remember, I only know English. Sorry. But that means that when he's governing these, that he has a boss, and that boss's name is the King of France.
And since John held titles in France which were in service to the French king, Philippe believed that John had no choice but to attend. John, of course, had a different interpretation, and so when he continued to ignore these summons, it was seen as an offence and war. As you'll likely know, in times of war, a king would call upon his nobles to help him raise armies and win glory. And whilst John did do this, he was quick to belittle or ignore them whilst on campaign, which, when combined with the suspiciously timed death of the now imprisoned Arthur, led many to simply abandon him. And by 1204, John had lost all of this. Now lacking land, John was in a bit of a bind. Medieval kings were supposed to be warriors, but John had just shown he wasn't too brilliant at that. And whilst he did want to retake Normandy and the rest of his inheritance, he knew that he needed to wait. And so he focused on the ruling of England instead, unlike
which makes sense.
To be warriors.
We'll go back. Yeah, look at the huge loss of territory. Those northern lands of Normandy, gone. Just this massive territory reduced. And so it makes sense now, when previously you were holding half of France, it makes sense that people like King Richard were focused on the French portion of the kingdom. But now it makes sense that John starts focusing on the island more, considering the fact that a lot of their French territories are gone. Now, they're not gone indefinitely. They come back, and we still haven't even reached the 100 Years' War, which is where land's going to really shift back and forth quite a bit.
Now lacking land, John was in a bit of a bind. Medieval kings were supposed to be warriors, but John had just shown he wasn't too brilliant at that. And whilst he did want to retake Normandy and the rest of his inheritance, he knew that he needed to wait. And so he focused on the ruling of England instead. Unlike his brother, John was very involved in the actual day-to-day running of his kingdom. But because of said brother's crusade and ransom, England was broke. And so John became a...
So he inherits a destitute kingdom. Crusading was incredibly expensive. And that's why it was primarily a kings and nobles game. If we were to go back and actually see a Crusader army, your leaders would be pretty well armored and kitted out. A lot of other people, whatever they had, and it's because a lot of other people went for the fervor, but they weren't going to get armored and prepped out by the leadership. They just weren't. So a lot of people are... So the main crux of these armies were the rich, and it cost a lot to get across the entire continent.
Obsessed with raising money. Now, John was not much of a people pleaser and did everything he could to be as unlikable as humanly possible. He was paranoid, cruel, and not very pious, which didn't endear him to, well, anyone. And since John had plotted against a king himself, he believed that his earls and barons were likely plotting against him too. As such, he wanted to weaken them, and even those who were fiercely loyal to him were subject to arbitrary fines and had to pay him to inherit or remarry. If they refused, John would then deprive them of their lands, which made the rest of the nobles very nervous. In 1208, John got into a fight with the Pope over who got to be the next Archbishop of Canterbury, and when he refused to behave, he got himself excommunicated the next year.
And this is another issue that a lot of kings have throughout England, throughout European history, in the late... I don't know the right term for that. The late first century, or the late first millennia into the second millennium, is who gets to pick church leadership. And that's going to be a big sticking point that leads to a lot of conflict between Rome and the other kingdoms throughout Europe.
This was a big deal and caused massive disruption to the day-to-day lives of many English people. And so, after 3 years of this, he agreed to pay fealty to the Pope in return for his excommunication being reversed, but again, his reputation was pretty much in the toilet at this point. John continued his long and proud tradition of upsetting everyone around him until 1214, which was when he, the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor all decided to humble Philippe II and so agreed to invade France. His nobles refused to help, John ended up achieving nothing, and the next year they were in open rebellion against him. After many of his supporters abandoned him, he was forced to negotiate, and this is when he signed the famous Magna Carta. This document is seen as the beginning of the end of absolute monarchy in England. This is when he signed the famous Magna Carta. This document is seen as...
Yep. So and this is very much so his abridged version, Leave the church well alone. Don't mess with the Catholic Church. Leave them be. Stop ripping us off of our inheritance. So inheritance taxes were high. Now, I'm sure this was a way for John to try to bring money back into the treasury after Richard spent so much off crusading, but that's beside the point. Women should be allowed to keep some of their dead husband's stuff. That goes back to we talked about before when we discussed the best times throughout history to live. That it usually sucks for women, but in a number of places, and in this case, is women are at least owed some of the inheritance, which is not always the case. Ideas also, they can stay single afterwards because they're like sad and stuff. Okay. That's a funny way to put the fact that they are not beholden to get remarried. Anti-Semitism is not a new reality. It's long time been a held-on piece. I'm going to ask you really quickly. Alright. Yep, so again, this is the same basic ideas. Is if any earl, baron, or other person that holds lands directly to the crown or military service shall die. So if you are serving the crown, if you are a noble off at war in France, you die and your children inherit your territory, you don't have to pay that inheritance tax. You died in the peace. And for £100, the entirety of the barony shall go there. Are there? Alright. Under age and award, when he shall come of age, his inheritance without relief or fine. Alright. Yeah. There's a lot of big things that come directly out of the Magna Carta that come back later on. Maybe one day we'll go back and just like go through it entirely. I don't want this video to go on forever. But
the beginning of the end of absolute monarchy in England and as the foundation of the rights of free men. Whilst this isn't strictly untrue, the vast majority of people at the time weren't free, and the primary role of the document was to give the barons of England far, far greater power. John signed it, and 5 seconds after the barons' armies had...
Yeah, you'll notice as you go through here, pretty much all of the stuff, all the great things that go toward people are going specifically to barons and lords and nobles. The average person is closer to a serf at this point. They don't have the legal right, the legal protections that come along with full participation and full recognition. So this will be true later on as well. Let's say under the English Bill of Rights, there is a freedom of speech clause effectively built in, but that freedom of speech clause did not inherently go to the everyday English citizen. Instead, it was only meant to apply to members of Parliament in open discussion on the floor about law and the British government. Yeah, again, we don't really have time to dive into all this, but moving on.
Disbanded, he reneged and restarted the war. John did much better this time, and the barons then asked the King of Scotland to invade the north to help out. They also invited Prince Louis, the heir to the French throne, to rule England and save them from John. Louis accepted, and along with the Scottish and the rebels occupied these parts of England. At this point, John wasn't in a good place, but this would be fixed in 1216, when he died. His young son was crowned Henry III, and with John gone, the reasons for the rebellion were dead too. Louis was told to go home, and the nobles eventually agreed to a watered-down version of Magna Carta. In the end, John died facing a rebellion of his nobles and foreign invasions of his kingdom. Whilst he did inherit a kingdom under financial strain, he personally made everything much, much worse.
Yeah.
He upset his great lords who were vital to his power base, and alongside his middling generalship, he lost most of his French lands. He was deeply unlikable, and this, combined with his paranoia, meant that he acted in a way that was deeply offensive to the sensibilities of the time. To summarise, King John didn't get the best start. However, he sucked and so made it all much, much worse, and many of the problems of his reign went away the second he died.
So, back to the original point, back to the original question. Yes, there are outside factors. That's something that I kind of jumped on immediately when I said that the answer is the third piece, where he says, is it a mixture of both? Yes. He's broke. The kingdom has suffered pretty horrifically economically. And they are not in a good position to fight outside threats, which isn't great when John comes in and instigates outside threats and outside fights. But, alright, so yeah, that pretty much sticks with the standard reality or the standard idea that King John is not good at his role as king. Okay? Alright, that's a relatively short one. We will see you in the next video. Let me know if that's something you'd like to actually look at, is us go through and discuss some of the Magna Carta or some of those older documents. It'd actually be kind of nice to go back and read some of those again. I haven't read some of those in their entirety since college, which, God, oh my God, it's been 8 years since I think I read some of those. Besides the point, let me know what you're going to see next. Let me know what videos you want to see, and have a great day. Bye.